One does not become an architect of Professor Benninger's stature without being one's own sharpest critic. His humility and incredible ability to stand back and honestly reflect on what could be better, I'm sure will be carried on to not only envision but further realize the transformative impact of his design and design thinking. In my conversations with him, I found him to be more Indian than most and someone who's acutely sensitive to our unique ecosystem and optimistic about the opportunities it provides to creatively solve for some of the most relevant problems we face as a society in India. For the Those Who Design series, we open doors to the otherwise behind closed doors conversations, keeping it candid and honest, for which I thank him in advance.
What are your thoughts about the transformational perspective of design? You know, when I went to design school, at least in undergraduate, in my undergraduate school, they often told us that design had this transformational quality. It was not merely about form and function only. You could truly influence behavior. You could truly maybe change society and things like that. What are your thoughts around this?
Let me take it back a few steps. When we used to study architecture, we would study things like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, Mies van der Rohe, the Barcelona Pavilion. Now, the reality is that we were romantics and we fell for this line of thinking. Actually, none of those three buildings is habitable. You couldn't really live in Villa Savoy. It was a kind of a showpiece designed by a multi-millionaire. And of course, the pavilion was a national pavilion. And Kaufman, Edward J. Kaufman, built a number of houses around America from well-known architects, more or less as a collector. Like people collect pictures, they collected houses and pieces of architecture. When I was studying at Harvard, we had the Carpenter Center by Le Corbusier. I was a follower of modern architecture, so as any religious fanatic, I was thrilled that we had a Le Corbusier building on campus. But let me now look back and tell you, frankly, this is a terrible building. Terrible because it's not contextual. It's exposed concrete in a local regional style of brick and wood frames, etc. in the windows. The other thing is it was not really a very functional building. I actually studied under Mirko Bossadella, painting there. And well, it was fun as an architect to walk up ramps and to go around circular concrete stairs, etc. But frankly, it was not built to be functional. It was an architect's architecture. Now, if you carry that further, you see this happened at Harvard in the 60s, early 60s. Huh? And then at the same time, Alvar Aalto built the student Baker House residence at MIT. I think he thought he was at Harvard because he did brick, and actually MIT is more of a limestone campus. But these architects were doing collector's items. No? They weren't integrating with the local context. They were trying to say, look at me. And I think if you look at the whole modern movement, we grew up thinking that we're doing iconic buildings, which would come on the front cover of the magazine, and we would become famous people, and that's what architects did. We became Le Corbusier or Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, transition, you see, this was an age of romanticism. When Kenzo Tange did the Tokyo Bay City, a city floating on water, and we all said, well, that's great. It was the same thing with Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City. It was a suburban city where you would need at least 2 cars to live in those houses. So we grew up in I call it the age of romanticism, but in a country like India, I think we have to get serious about objective reality. To me, these are the kind of questions which should be plaguing architects today, is that where were we going over the last 100 years, huh? From the Bauhaus, the international movement of modern architecture, Team 10, the metabolists in Japan. We were talking about style. We were talking about fashionable things, about finishes, materials, etc. Now, somehow, I think we should be looking at architecture as a social tool. Can architects make the basic healthcare systems in this country more effective? Can we come up with low-cost housing solutions which actually make shelter accessible to everyone? I know we can do it. They're showing us buildings which have nothing to do with what we do in India. The heroic buildings like CCTV Tower in Beijing, I mean, really give me a break. I mean, that building doesn't solve any problem at all. It's an icon, it's photogenic, and it can be shown to the world as a modern building. And this, I'm not blaming Renzo Piano for that. I'm sorry, it's not Renzo, it's Ren Koolhaas for that. Because we're all doing it, you know? Even I do it in some cases. I build gee whiz looking buildings and they get published on the front page of the magazine. And Christopher Charles Benninger is happy to see his picture on his building there. But that's not what Christopher Charles Benninger should be doing. Architects surprisingly play a critical role of bringing people together in public spaces and creating an atmosphere for exchange of ideas.
You know, the Prime Minister is talking about make in India, to be self-sustaining and so on. But I've often, before we make in India, I've often thought about what about designing in India, and what your thoughts are about design in India or Indian design, or what it means to be here and solving those problems before we start making or manufacturing or going towards the production side of things.
But I feel 99.9% of the projects, the foreign architects have no clue of how to work in India. We have our own ecosystem, we have our own materials, we have wonderful workers and laborers, huh? And I don't think people understand how our labor team works.
From an urban design standpoint, the project's coming along beautifully. So talk to us a little bit about, all the way from inception through delivery. What were the big moves you made?
I always like to go back and say the first garden cities in the world were what? Believe it or not, they were cantonments in India. And there were people like a friend of Ebenezer Howard Wilkinson, who was banned from the UK for 2 years and made a trip to look at the cantonments in India and Australia. So what is a cantonment? First, you divide the white-skinned people from the dark. Then you divide the men from the women. And then you start dividing things up by rank. And then if you come into, say, Pune University, it's a cantonment. You divide the women and boys as much as possible, the senior professors from the junior ones, from the class 4. And so the model of designing townships in India, whether it's a company town, whether it's a university, is this cantonment model. I always like to say that we're Indians and that one of the things the British left us with was some very wrong ideas about city planning, including having boulevards and very automobile-oriented road systems, etc. I think Chandigarh was a bad idea. It was a bad idea for India. It became a model. It became the role model, and it's a beautiful place. It would go nice in Florida, or maybe most of Europe couldn't afford it probably when it was built. But it's not a model for India. Most Indians could never afford to live there.
What struck me, or the way I read the plan, was that interestingly, it seemed like it was centered around the spine. It sort of, the spine might have started at the building that's sort of crescent shaped, mm-hmm. and you get a spine, and in the middle there is a sort of a large public plaza. The spine leads on to kind of 3 quads, these triangular shaped courtyards, and there's a building in each of those, which probably was a library or something like that. You walk along this beautiful kind of a walkway or a promenade with water bodies on both sides, which leads to this very massive open air theater that pivots around a big water body. And then there are these 2 sentinel, very tall residential blocks, which again was, like you said in the beginning, to me, the density of this place seemed to be, quite different from what I have seen in other universities. And curiously, on the other side, or if I may call it the other side of the campus, there was this school, and there was another tall, I guess it was the faculty residences building.
Yes.
Right. Which seemed to be somewhat disconnected from the central spine. as it were. Now, that might have been because of site conditions or something. And I wondered why that was.
One of the things is we decided that this would be a totally pedestrian campus. If you go to Pune University, almost every university in America, here there are automobiles driving through the campus. We said, yes, emergency vehicles could come in. Certain times of day, utility vehicles may be allowed, but too, they should be electric and slow moving. So we said this is going to be a totally pedestrian campus. And then we said, yes, that curved building that you mentioned is the Welcome Center. When people come there either instead of online, if they want to come in and apply, or they want to just come and see the campus before they apply. There are people to welcome you and take you around. There's admissions office, things like that there. Parcels are delivered there, whatnot. And then there is a spine. I think you're a planner and you got it precisely. And that spine breaks into basically 3 quadrangles. One which you can't see yet in the reality because we're going to put the facade on there, is a library or knowledge center in the middle of a quadrangle. And then another quadrangle has a 500-seater auditorium, and another one has 250-seater auditorium. And so you get things which are common resources shared in the middle of these quadrangles. And then you get on the ground and first floor all around these teaching areas, and above those there's researchers and faculty.
Question before you move on to the other bits. Because these big central buildings would have capacity of 500 people, and then around that I would imagine there would be classrooms, and the proximity seems to be quite intimate. Would you imagine that from a acoustic standpoint, or from a lot of people using it coming in and out, would you think there may have been or maybe disturbance issues, or they are planned in such a way particularly to make sure that certain things happen in certain ways during the time?
In the most of in all the buildings, there's a layer. Like the curved auditorium, there's actually a big arcade inside with kind of vaulted ceiling, and from there you enter into the auditorium. So these big plazas outside, and I agree with you, they could have several thousand students hanging around. We're going to put some autos and seats there. They could be a little bit noisy. But on the other hand, even the classroom buildings have an arcade, and then you enter into the classroom. So that's an issue, but I think the client was very aware of these kind of things. And in fact, these are discussions which will continue, because when a client moves into a building, it always turns out to be different than what they saw in the architect's 3Ds and walkthroughs. So it's like a marriage, Everything is nice, and then you move into your first apartment and you find out that somebody belches after the meal, and you didn't expect that.
One of the quads, you see the spine connects to the buildings in the middle of 2 of the quads, but one of the quads is kind of blocked off from the spine. Is there a special building in the middle of that quad? You know what I'm talking about?
I'll tell you. See, I didn't want to create a sort of a regimented, absolutely symmetrical campus. It's not that, American campuses can even be 1,000 acres. Pune University is 600 acres now. This is just 70 acres. People can walk now. And I didn't want to create something like, okay, we've got, we're building a Mount Vernon or something outside of Washington for Washington to live in. This is rather, we wanted to break that kind of semester. And I want to add one more thing. Another thing right from day one was the issue of water. Now, you asked a very good question. There's 2 towers which face right at each other. Well, I didn't like that. But what happens when you have a site? Frankly, there were only 3 places on that site where legally we could put towers. And also we wanted the students to be near a very large. Those tall buildings, the ground plus 2, and there's a big commons area, are all common facilities for students now. So I never would have liked to put 2 towers facing each other. Not from the privacy viewpoint, but just from the views and things like that. But frankly, we had absolutely no choice.
So my last question to you is a cheeky one, and I'm going to turn you into a critic of your own master plan, and I'm going to ask you what went well, and if I were to ask you to critique this in the purview of the discussion we've had, not just as a urban design critique, because we both know things change, all of those things happen, but in the big picture, right? How design is transformational, the idea of design in India, urban design specifically in India, so this relationship between, or this value match between the client, you, and the user, and all of these people who are going to come to this campus and use it. What would your parting thoughts be?
See, one thing I want to point out is that this campus would probably have a greater variety of students. The only thing being common is that they've done on a meritorious selection procedure. They're all equal. But I think it costs, let's say, about 3 lakhs a student per year, maybe a little bit more. And about half the students come on scholarships from the Premji Foundation. But I have a friend of mine who's a very senior doctor in Bangalore, working at the Narayana Health Center, who's come back from the UK. And his son said, no, I want to study there. Why? Because there will be students from all different areas of India and all different classes, and I want to interact with them. There are students like that who want to come to the Premji campus, and they want to be involved in social change. So I think it's important to remember this is I'm going to use the word small town, designed to create people whose lives are going to be involved in transformation and social change. I'm not terribly happy about the high-rise buildings. I want more trees, that can happen. It will happen, and fortunately we're all on the same page in that. Pretty much, I would say that I predict that there's going to be more parking problems. And I had proposed underground parking at some places. I guess that could always come later. So to me, that's an issue still hanging in the air, but it's something, fortunately, that can be solved in 20 years from now.